The American Revolution is the original OG successful revolution. And we as conservatives, Vance, we are conserving the liberal revolution, the pro-liberty, limited government, civil society-oriented revolution of the American founders. And that's something I'd be very happy to be called a conservative about.
Hello, welcome again to another episode in the Let People Prosper show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to bring on someone who has been working in the think tank space and for foundations and just really moving the needle for liberty and freedom conservatism and so much more. And it's none other than John Hood. John, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Thank you very much for having me, Vance.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. We've got a lot to talk about. But before we get into that, let me go ahead and read your bio for the audience. So, John Hood is president of the John William Pope Foundation, a Raleigh-based grant maker. He is also the author of 10 books ranging from economic histories and political biographies to fantasy novels, and teaches at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy. Since 1986, he has written a syndicated column that now runs in the Winston-Salem Journal, Greensboro News and Record, Wilmington Star News, Triangle Business Journal, and many more. He's also written for the Wall Street Journal, National Review, and other major outlets. He chairs the North Carolina Institute of Public Leadership and serves as vice chair of North Carolina Public Radio, State Policy Network, and the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. He has also co-founded the Freedom Conservatism Project and formerly led the John Locke Foundation in North Carolina as its president for more than 2 decades. He received his BA in journalism from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he earned an MA in liberal studies from UNC Greensboro. So, with all that fun stuff going on, John, let me go and ask you the first question I do all the guests. Why do you do what you do every day?
I enjoy it. And it puts food on the table for my family. All the usual reasons that people do jobs. I don't enjoy every aspect of my job, but I genuinely enjoy writing. I enjoy speaking and being on broadcast programs. I enjoy evaluating grant proposals. A lot of my day job now running the Pope Foundation is as a grant maker. And one of the things that appeals to me about that job is that it kind of reminds me of my first job as a newspaper reporter. Every day I come to the office and I learn something new. I get to talk to someone new. At the Pope Foundation, we support public policy organizations, for sure. It's our largest single category of giving. We also support universities and colleges. We support soup kitchens and homeless shelters and ballet companies and all sorts of other activities in which I have an interest. So it's a constant learning opportunity. And it's one of the great joys of being in this kind of a role.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love it. And when you're looking at this and going throughout your career, being a president of a think tank and now doing this stuff now and working at universities and everything else, what do you think really got you motivated to do that? As you think about kind of growing up and different maybe inflection points in your life, were there certain things that kind of gave you this calling over time?
I'm one of those rather boring people who, when I was a young man, a young lad, really, wanted to be a newspaper columnist and a TV talking head and be involved in writing books and things. And that's pretty much exactly what I did.
Nice.
I also was a performer when I was young, and my twin brother and I were a song and dance team and toured around and did a lot of shows. And I flirted when I got to college with the idea of going into the performing arts, realized very quickly there was no money in that. I enjoyed it, but there was no money in that.
Yeah.
And so my twin brother, who made the same decision, then went to law school, which was a much better decision regarding finances than my choice, which was journalism, which I'm not sure paid any better than performing arts, at least at first.
Yeah.
But I did pursue my passions. I did have an opportunity in college to create a magazine and hire people and fire people and do all the things that I would eventually do. So I ended up doing pretty much the set of jobs that I had anticipated. I had even flirted when I was early in college. I kind of enjoyed the college experience. I thought maybe one day I could spend some time teaching at a university. And about a decade ago, I started doing that too. So I've had an opportunity to pursue a variety of different roles. And right now I'm a teacher of 3 different groups. I teach leadership programs, and I've been doing that for about 25 years. These are usually young professionals. I teach graduate students at Duke University public policy, and I teach tweens and teens how to tap dance. I haven't figured out which of my 3 groups of students is the most mature, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's probably my 8, 9, 10-year-olds who are learning how to tap dance.
Yeah.
Because they know exactly why they're there and they're having fun doing it.
That's awesome. Well, what about all these books? You've written a number of books, including political biographies, fantasy novels, economic histories. I mean, you're kind of all over the place, John. How
That's
did you
a nice
get into
thing
that?
to say.
Yeah. but what got you interested in some of those things?
Well, I did, again, sort of choose my book subjects according to what I wanted to learn about.
Okay.
Naturally, when you write a book, you're writing for readers and you want there to be readers. And many of my books have had readers, which means, of course, but my first book actually came from an opportunity that was presented to me. At that time, this was in the mid-'90s, the Heritage Foundation had a program called the Bradley Visiting Fellows. A couple of people would come to Heritage for a year at a time and work on a book project. That was interesting to me. I had spent some time in Washington early in my career, so it's kind of a fun idea to come back and spend some time there. I had a great time. I'm a newspaper guy, so I hit my deadlines, and my book was finished early and sent to the printer. I had not chosen that topic. It was what we would now call ESG. It was basically about corporate social responsibility and taking a more free market approach to what corporations' responsibilities, what the leaders of corporations should be doing with their resources. Had a lot of fun doing that. And it was me and another Bradley fellow who never finished his book. Tucker Carlson and I had very different work ethics. But he did get a chance to read my book and gave me some useful advice. So after that, I decided a natural follow-up to that, talking about the origin of the American corporation and the social, not just economic, but social role that it's played in progress in America. I decided to look at the intersection of investing and politics, and that became my book, Investor Politics, in 2001. Famously disastrous book launch, though. The book ended up selling pretty well, but my book launch was on September 11th, 2001.
Wow.
So you can imagine we didn't really do a book event. We just brought big screen TVs into the hotel ballroom and just showed the coverage of what was happening.
Wow.
And then I wrote a book about advertising because I was interested in advertising and wanted to defend it. I wrote a book about a former North Carolina governor, the only Republican who's ever been reelected. North Carolina, people associate it, that's my home state, people associate it with red states. It's a pretty competitive state. And in fact, Republicans typically struggle to elect governors. North Carolina has only had 3 Republican governors since the turn of the 20th century.
Wow.
And only one of them ever got, an opportunity and actually won re-election. So that's the subject I chose. I had named an organization after him already. Yeah. And so it seemed like a good thing to do to write his biography. I enjoyed that very much, but it was a lot of work. And when my wife, when we got finished, my wife read the book. She liked the book. She praised the book and said, "John, that is a great biography you wrote. No more books." Now, this was surprising to me because I always have good ideas for book subjects. And she said, "Great, find someone to write them.
Okay.
Because you're not writing any more books." And this went on for years. At the beginning of 2020, I got ill, not with what would become COVID, but with a stomach bug. And I was at home. And as you can tell by my biography and my life story, I don't really do leisure very well.
Yeah.
So I was stuck at home for several days. I decided to write a short story of just a weird idea I'd had for decades about a young Daniel Boone going up a mountain to hunt and encountering a fairy and a giant monster cat. So I wrote the short story just sort of to entertain myself and my wife and my brother. I sent the story to my brother. I printed it out for my wife and fell back into the bed and fell asleep. A couple hours later, she came into the room and she sort of cocked her head in a way that gets my attention and said, "Where's chapter 2?" And so it turned out that the judge had modified her consent decree and I was allowed to write fiction books.
Nice.
But nonfiction books, I still have to find other authors to pursue the topic. So that's why one of the reasons I made my transition to fiction. I've written 3 novels and 3 novelettes. all set in the same fictional universe. Early America.
Yeah.
I'm using fictional characters and even some fantasy elements to tell the story of America, its birth, its development as a country. Each of the books depicts a particular period in American history. And so now I'm working on the fourth novel, which will depict the American Civil War.
Wow. I love it because you're using different sides of your brain and everything with the writing those different ones. And so that's fantastic. And you're right. You got to listen to the boss, what they're going to tell you to which way to go. So I'm glad you went down the fiction route for now.
People ask me sometimes, well, why would you write historical fantasy? And I would answer very much an answer you're already prepared to hear from me, which is I've always liked history.
Yeah.
I've always enjoyed fantasy. If I'm going to write a series of books, I want to at least enjoy reading them myself.
Yeah.
And so let's just mash the two together and do historical fantasy.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. What have you been teaching? What are you teaching right now?
Well, I teach a course for graduate students in public policy at Duke University on American conservative thought, American conservative policymaking. So I give them a background of all the ideas from ancient medieval thinkers, early modern thinkers. But this is not a philosophy course, so we do a little bit of that. It's mostly a practical course for students on how conservatives approach public policy, whether at the federal level or the state level. I did a little bit of reporting at the federal level, but my policy work is primarily at the state level. So I use this opportunity to explore with students, almost none of whom are right of center, of course, because they're in a public policy school, and that's just not something that you see very much of. But what they want to learn about is how do conservatives think about healthcare? How do conservatives think about transportation or education or tax policy or regulation in the 21st century? Because they want to be prepared. If they go work on the Hill, if they work in a administration, Democratic governor, for example, in maybe a state with a Republican legislature, if they want to go to work in Arizona, for example, they want to be able to, even if they're working for a Democrat, understand where other people are coming from, understand the kinds of arguments that might convince a Republican lawmaker who identifies as a conservative to vote for, let's say, a Democratic bill. So I'm not propagandizing my student. I don't believe that that's a good idea. I don't think it typically works anyway.
Yeah.
But we do believe that students who go through the public policy course, particularly a graduate level master's degree, they need to be exposed to a variety of different tools of public policy, from econometrics all the way to doing case studies and narratives and marketing. But also, they ought to, if they're a left-wing student, and I ask them, explain what supply-side economics is, they should be able to give an answer that is not a caricature.
Yeah.
And similarly, when I have conservative students, I would challenge them. I want you to make the best possible case for the Affordable Care Act and explain what the benefits are and why different kinds of people might find it attractive. That's what a public policy program ought to be doing, is training its students to understand issues from multiple points of view.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, I think that's great. And it's unfortunate nowadays because there's not that discussion going on as often, or at least not civilly. It seems like people just want to yell into one microphone or one platform wherever they want, compared to having these discussions. And oftentimes, John, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, it seems like sometimes to me is that maybe they don't really understand their viewpoint or the other viewpoint. Maybe it's the other viewpoint as much as they should. And so that's one reason why they get into the situation of yelling at each other or calling people names, compared with making a strong case for their beliefs. And, it's one of these things where you and I have been working on the Freedom Conservatism, which I want to get into and talk about. And, it sets itself apart from the national conservatism sort of movement or other types of movements that are out there, populists and things of that nature. Because of this, because of these kind of tensions that we feel, maybe these are mostly on the right now that we're talking between NatCons, FreeCons, but there's also the assumptions that seem to go into the thinking, the research, the solutions that are out there that aren't necessarily aligned, and that's why I found so helpful and useful to have the Freedom Conservatism sort of language and principles that are out there, which I was an initial signatory of, to really start to make the case for that. But I wanted to get your thoughts on this, John, because you've been thinking about this much deeper and longer than I have, and I wanted to see where did you start to get the idea that we needed something else, that we needed kind of a freedom conservatism or something else that was happening out there? Was there a specific point in time, or is this just something that's kind of come out over time?
Well, naturally, the descent down the golden escalator was an event that transformed lots of things. It transformed American electoral politics, but also began to transform the conservative movement about 10 years ago. Now, there were pre-existing disputes. I mean, in fact, the American conservative movement, going back to its origins in the middle of the 20th century, the modern day conservative movement that really began during and after World War II, it was always a place of robust debate, where former Trotskyites and former Stalinists and Christian conservatives and libertarians, emigres from Austria, had a lot of differences, but found enough in common to work together to create institutions, to create policy agendas, but kept arguing the whole time, and not always civilly, but there was an argument. And there was any political movement. Look at the left right now. You mentioned that national conservatives and freedom conservatives and other groups of conservatives are debating each other. That's true. There is a robust debate happening on the left after the 2024 election cycle. A lot of disappointed people, really kind of shocked that Trump won again. Many of the Democrats are. And there is this, someone might associate it with AOC or Bernie Sanders or other kinds of more left-wing activists, that the reason the Democrats didn't do better is because they didn't own their leftist sympathies enough. I mean, they didn't promise enough that Kamala Harris had been too modest in her promises, and her agenda was too cautious. And if you really want to win and beat those bad guys on the right, you've got to go full-throated social democrat. And then there's more of an abundance Democrat group, associated with writers and some politicians who are saying, actually, including, interestingly, Gavin Newsom, governor of California, who's most usually associated with the more left part of the Democratic Party. I don't think that's accurate anymore. I think he's actually trying to move towards a sort of a center-left position that is pro-growth, certainly still social democrat in many implications and having public assistance programs and things like that, but being a little more oriented towards how do we build things, how do we make things happen, and not just in the public sector. So there's a robust debate. I don't know if it's robust enough for the Democrats right now for their future, but I think some people understand they need to have it. And on the right, there's a robust debate. What has happened is, and you alluded to my work with university students. I have long subscribed to the proposition that if you can't make a plausible sounding argument for the other side, you do not understand your own side. This is an essential truth about public policy and political rhetoric even. You're not going to be persuasive if all you do is engage in straw man attacks. Those can work in the short run, but they don't work in the long run. And that's at least what I tell my students and what I strongly believe. Now, I spent most of my career, in addition to running think tank, I mean, I'm not an economist, I'm a journalist, so I hired economists, so I hire political scientists, I hire engineers, I hire people who have expertise. But what is my expertise? Communications, marketing, journalism, branding things. And one of my concerns, among many, in the last decade, as the conservative movement began to fracture, began to drift, began to be captured by a more, what I consider to be a more populist element, which frankly is populism in a sort of ideological sense. It's not an ally of traditional conservatism. It is, in fact, a rival. Historically, 100 years ago, conservatives were trying to stop the populists. I mean, this is not a new thing. But as I started to see that, I had concerns about their ideas and their principles, and we could talk about the list of free-con principles in a moment. But I even had the concern of, if I'm arguing against the national conservatives, what am I? What do I say? Do I say, well, I'm for traditional conservatism or Reagan conservatism or Buckley conservatism? I did come up in that age, and I am a Reagan generation person, but that all sounds very backward looking. It's attached to a particular person, and a very effective rhetorical response, whether you think it's substantial or not, is, why are you trapped in the 1980s? Why do you keep talking about Ronald Reagan? This is 2010, 2020, 2025. We've got different problems, and you're stuck in the past. So my marketing challenge, which I took on and worked with some people and wrote some articles for National Review exploring different ways to define ourselves. And I suggested different options, like maybe we should just distinguish ourselves from the nationalist populist right, many of whom are from other countries and seem to think that European style thrown in altar, blood and soil conservatism is relevant to America. I say, no, we're American conservatives. We'll call ourselves Americans.
Yeah.
And then it occurred to me, that's way too corny. I suggested one of the things that American conservatives have always done is attempt to conserve the classical conservatism and classical liberalism together that motivated the American founding. So if we're conserving classical liberalism, like we could be libcons. And then I said, boy, that's inviting someone to punch me in the face.
Yeah.
Calling myself a libcon. So I ended up talking myself into FreeCon. I think it's a pretty straightforward brand.
Yeah.
So, and I don't want to belabor the point, but labels matter. How we explain our ideas in brief ways, even as something as a logo or one word, is an important part of being effective, being persuasive. We don't always get to choose our labels. A lot of political labels or even religious labels were originally insults. I don't know if you know this or not, but Whig and Tory, which were associated with the first two English parties, the Whig Party and the Tory Party, those were both insults. They were chosen by the people who were Whigs. In fact, the Tories called them Whigs because Whig was basically a Scottish word. Whigamore, it basically meant redneck.
I see.
Make a long story short.
Yeah.
You're just a bunch of rednecks from the sticks. You're the country party. You're all those bumpkins. And then the Whigs called the Royalists the Tories because Toreador was a Irish term that meant bandit. All right. So these were insults, but the two groups accepted the insults and sort of bought into them. So we don't get to choose our own labels very often. And I think FreeCon is a label worth choosing. And so that's why we came up with it. And then on the statement of principles, my co-conspirator on this, Ovid Roy, had proposed, we were at a meeting together, and he said, we need to do a new statement of principles for American conservatism, like the 1960 Sharon Statement, more updated to today, grappling with the 21st century issues. And I wanted to come up with a new term. And so we mashed these two ideas together, and that became the Freedom Conservatism Statement of Principles. We drafted a small committee. I particularly wanted to focus on bringing younger people. I mean, I'm almost 60. I didn't think I would necessarily be able to write a statement that would speak to what a 25 or 30-year-old feels passionately about. So we actually had some young people as part of the drafting committee, and we drafted a statement of principles. We recruited people like Vance, Ginn, to join the statement. And we released it in the summer of 2023. And since then, we've added hundreds of additional signatories representing all sorts of different backgrounds. Some of them are think tankers. They run organizations or work in think tanks or do research. Some of them are political activists, like a Grover Norquist, for example. Some of them have worked in politics, like a Karl Rove, or lots of other signatories have actually worked in partisan politics or have run for office. Yeah. We have former governors, we have former members of Congress, former legislative leaders at the state and the federal level who are signatories at state, former mayors. I mean, people who actually run for office. And then we have scholars, we have university professors, we have donors, we have teachers. So a variety of different people. And you may notice, Vance, other groups like this, they have sort of the cool kids, and they list like 8 really important people. And then, it's small type. They mention, so other people have signed. Yeah. We don't really like hierarchies like that. So we just made a long list, and we just keep adding alphabetically to the list, whoever wants to sign it, who works in the movement. I mean, we do have to have people who have some sort of a role to play in the American conservative movement. And I'll just say my final thing. I know I filibuster a little bit about this, but it's important. Some friends of mine say, why are you even using the term conservative? It's been ruined. You should call yourselves classical liberals or free marketeers or something else. And my answer to them is, you really don't get fully to choose your lingo. In America, not in Latin America, not in Europe, but in North America, in the United States, conservative has become the term that is generally applied to people who want smaller government. And liberal or progressive, which is the term I typically use, that is associated with bigger government. Now, you can talk your way out of that sack, maybe, but I doubt it. And so what I want to do is own the fact that we are the right in America. But the right in America is different from the right around the world. But we're trying to defend a revolutionary legacy, a revolution that was a successful revolution. Didn't go out. It was based on human nature and real truths, not all the crazy stuff that motivated the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, all that. The American Revolution is the original OG successful revolution. And we as conservatives, Vance, we are conserving the liberal revolution, the pro-liberty, limited government, civil society-oriented revolution of the American founders. And that's something I'd be very happy to be called a conservative.
Yeah, exactly. Same here. No, well put, as usual, John. And you're right. I mean, so a couple of years ago, we had our first meeting and kind of, had some good sessions and everything. And then there was a second meeting. And then this year, though, we had the first Freedom Conservatism event. And I think it went really well. It was a packed crowd, and there were a number of sessions. I'm hopeful for the next one and look forward to that. And but it really is kind of a wide ranging number of people from different backgrounds and everything else. And I think that's what also gives me so much encouragement because, John, we hear a lot about the national conservatism, which, if you have to boil it down, it's kind of a mixture of populism, really stating that government, if we just had the right people in charge, we could get what we want done through government. And so there's a lot more of what I call a top-down government approach in the NatCon direction, which is based on a lot of progressivism. But there's a wide range of people that are on that side as well, and there's some good discussion. But I got kind of upset with that direction. In the populist direction. And as me, I'm more classical liberal, more libertarian in a lot of sense. So that's why I think the freedom conservatism really came clear to me of my background as an economist and historian and everything else. And so it really brought it out. And then you saw the principles. And so I like to go through those principles together. I've got them here and I'll put them in the show notes as well. But the first one is liberty. Which I think is so important about our founding, going back to your point, John, about the revolution and everything else that they were fighting for at that time was really about having that liberty. And then pursuit of happiness and then the foundation of prosperity are the top three there. To you, why do you think those are the best three to have to start off with? Not necessarily that they're all in order, but these are the first three that I think are huge. But what about to you? What do they mean to you?
Well, the first thing to say about the Freedom Conservatism Project, or really conservatism in America for generations, is that it has always been a blending or a simultaneous practice of the politics of liberty and the politics of virtue. Yeah. The founders believed that. The founders famously, multiple founders said something to the effect, we are creating a government that will constrain ambition, that will take human nature seriously, but it will not be sustainable only on its own terms. I mean, there are checks and balances and things, but if we do not inculcate virtue in future generations, if we don't have what we today, they didn't use this term then, but what we today would call a robust slice, a robust layer of civil society between individuals and the state, then the American system will fail. So that means we have to have strong families. We have to have religious congregations. We have to have communities that take care of each other. We have to have various kinds of ways that people associate with each other that isn't about their occupation. Again, we don't think about that as much today, but they did because many of them had immigrated or their ancestors had immigrated from England, Scotland, Ireland, France, Germany, some from Scandinavia. And they knew that the cultures they had left were so tradition bound, so high bound. So they absolutely were trying to write a constitution for a government, but they were writing a constitution for a government within a society that they had also thought needed to have certain other elements involved, including faith. Now, they weren't arguing for an established church, and I would be against that too. Yeah. But they were arguing that unless there are these other rich institutions, which government should at least not injure. Now, you could have a debate about what the relationship between government and faith-based institutions should be. And we could talk about that because it's implied in the statement that, for example, we support school choice. And that inevitably means some public dollars going to families who use them at institutions that may very well, in fact, most private schools are faith-based. And there are other kinds of things. We spend lots of Medicare and Medicaid dollars at Catholic hospitals, at Baptist hospitals, lots of facilities, lots of nonprofits, lots of charities that get public money do have a faith component. And I personally think that's fine. And I think if you don't do that, you're going to actively undermine civil society and create risks to freedom in the long run. So freedom and virtue, they are in tension, and there are differences of opinion about what predominates on a particular matter. And those are the kinds of those robust debates that we've had for generations. But you can't lose the liberty part. Mm-hmm. It's essential. And the reason why it's essential is America is a nation, but it isn't a nation like England is a nation, or Germany is a nation, or China is a nation. It has a different history. Our history is not something that is intelligible. If you think about nation as people who speak the same language, people have the same genetic makeup, actual ethnic stock, people have the same faith, because Americans did not have that from the start.
Right.
And we tend to say, well, I mean, they were all very similar. Yeah, I mean, they were similar in some ways, but let me tell you, I'm a Southerner. Carolinians had very, very great suspicions about Bostonians in the 1700s. Yeah. Not today, way before the Civil War, the late unpleasantness and all that. There were lots of disputes between Catholics and Protestants, between Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians and Anglicans. And some of that was live issues for the American founders. Thomas Jefferson, the reason he and James Madison championed religious liberty the way they did is because even though they were not dissenters, they knew in Virginia, Quakers and Baptists and others who had been oppressed, Presbyterians who were not allowed to marry because they wouldn't join the church. So their children were considered out of wedlock. And so their children were not considered legitimate children. I mean, there are all sorts of aspects to that we need to understand is not a new thing. It's an old thing. So what binds Americans together, even in the 1770s? What binds Americans together in the 1970s? And what binds Americans together in the 2020s is really a set of ideas and common experiences that is not specific to ethnicity. It's not specific to a particular church. And so these other theories as to how the American nation could be constructed that are imported from Europe or other places, Vance, they just don't apply to us.
Yeah.
It'll never work here. No. It never would have worked here. In the founding era, there were enslaved Africans. There were Native American communities. It was unclear exactly what role, if any, they were going to have in the American experiment. It took a long time for both of those groups to be fully integrated. Pretty soon, there were French speakers who were in America. There were Spanish speakers who were part of the United States. And the only way that the U.S. took shape as a real nation that we can all pledge allegiance to and support is that we didn't say it was about language or ethnicity or soil, because a lot of immigrants were moving here all the time and became Americans. So what is an American? Well, among other things, is someone who swears fealty to the Constitution and therefore venerates liberty. And so that's why liberty is important and right off the top. But what is liberty for? It is to build a life for yourself and your family. So that pursuit of happiness plank that you're talking about, which really has to do with, that's where we talk about strong families and how important they are. The government should at least not injure family formation. And arguably, there are things that government can do that can strengthen family formation and consistent with limited government. And then finally, that pursuit of that, the creating the opportunities for people, economic opportunities. A lot of what we're struggling with today is how do we convince Americans that we have solutions to make clothing less expensive, food less expensive, housing less expensive, college education's less expensive, transportation less expensive. How can they afford a better quality of life for themselves and their children? That's a challenge that we have to have good answers to. The populist nationalists claim it's raising protectionist barriers and having the federal government centrally plan the economy and things that you properly point out are more like left-wing ideas than traditional right-wing American ideas. And we can't just criticize them and say, that they're like progressive. That won't work. Right. We have to have our own answers. And that's what a lot of our free cons, including you, Vance, work on every day is how do we use our principles to improve education, improve healthcare, improve economic mobility, improve the opportunities for people to have a better life. Yeah. If we don't have a robust answer to those very real questions, we will fail.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're exactly right. Exactly right. Well put. I like the historical context of all that going into it. Because you're right, with that liberty that allows to let people prosper, which is kind of where my calling comes in and where I'm trying to do with this podcast, a lot of my other research that I do and everything else. And I think that's why it fits so well with the freedom conservatism principles. And the next one, So I just kind of bundling these in threes. We have the full faith in credit. We have the nation of laws, not men, and Americans by choice. Those three seem to embody to me that too much government's going to get in the way of not only our liberty, but the choices that we're able to make. And, John, one thing we're running into right now is from and this has been a bipartisan problem, is too much government spending, too much debt. The massive increases in interest rates over time, and we're seeing that some down some now, but then the manipulation of that by the Federal Reserve printing money, and then we get inflation, and we saw with that, how that inflationary pressure happened the last few years. And I think, right now, President Trump is talking a good game. In the first administration, which I worked in as chief economist for OMB, we could not get him to talk about spending. It was always about tax cuts and deregulation, which are good. We want pro-growth stuff, but spending was really the ultimate burden of what I was trying to push forward as much as possible. So it's good to hear those things. But for a statement of principles, why did you think it was so important to make sure that that was a part of this with a full faith and credit and so forth? Why was that so important to have that in there?
Well, these are important issues on their own. Fiscal responsibility, the rule of law, and a sensible immigration policy.
Yeah.
These are good issues on their own. But they also happen to be areas that distinguish us from our rivals on the right, from the populist nationalist right, the national conservatives. So does trade policy, which we put in that third principle we've already talked about. So we talk about trade, and that's an obvious one. We don't even need to bother to talk about that anymore, I suspect. That's a clear dividing line. But the others may not be as obvious.
Yeah.
We really take the federal budget deficit seriously. Our signatories really believe that we have to cut spending, including entitlements, that we have to take that into consideration. Frankly, we can't just cut a lot more federal taxes if we're not going to also cut spending, because the deficits that will result will have a lot of effects that are negative. They'll offset at least some of the effects of reducing the marginal tax rates. So we're taking this very seriously. I believe ultimately, that the federal government needs some sort of, at least a balanced budget requirement on operating expenses. State governments, most of them have that.
Yeah.
They don't actually, as you know well, Vance, state governments and local governments borrow money all the time. A balanced budget requirement does not mean that you can never borrow money. It means you can't borrow money for operating expenses.
Yeah.
I think a reasonable approach at the federal level is required, probably through a constitutional amendment. But before then, we need to have serious proposals to reduce the budget deficit as a share of GDP aggressively over the next 10 years, because the results, if we don't do that, would be disastrous. And frankly, the national conservatives, they didn't even mention the word deficit or debt in their statement, which is telling. On the rule of law point, we're also seeing a number of disputes now with the second Trump administration pursuing what you and I may agree are reasonable goals regarding, for example, compliance by universities with the Harvard and University of North Carolina cases on racial preferences. Universities really do need to comply with that, and they're not doing it yet. And immigration enforcement. The problem is that they're not following the law. The Trump administration. The rule of law applies to everybody. It applies even when it's inconvenient, and we are the ones exercising power. We still have to respect the rule of law, and it's essential. If we don't do this, the next Democratic president, the next Democratic Congress, is going to abuse the power that we give them by our own side doing this instead of following the rules. So this isn't just some sort of prissy, we're following the rules, but we're beautiful losers. No, we're arguing that as a practical matter, strengthening the federal government and taking it away from procedure and towards the rule of one person or rule of a few people is dangerous. It will actually make government bigger in the long run, even if you might accomplish something okay for the next couple of years. It's a disastrous in the long run, and we shouldn't do it kind of strategy. And then finally, immigration. I have differences of opinion occasionally with libertarian friends about borders. I think you have to have border enforcement because all countries have to be able to, enforce border controls against criminals and people with communicable diseases and people who have become public charges. And I think that's entirely legitimate. And America traditionally had a system like that. Once we had mass immigration, we had a system for intake and evaluation. We should do that. But this is not an anti-immigrant position. In fact, free cons believe that immigrants have done great things for America. Many people are descended from immigrants. And I mean recent immigrants. all my people were here by the early 1700s, just about. But some people's ancestors came more recently. Some ancestors came by force, as we know. So understanding America as a place where people from all different backgrounds, including people who move here voluntarily, could contribute, is part of the free con vision. And some, not all, but some of the nationalist populist right, not just against illegal immigrants, illegal immigration or full border control, just against immigration.
Yeah.
And we think that that's a disastrous choice.
Yeah, totally. There's one of the things about economics is people move with their feet and where they don't like where they're at. And that's one of the beauties of kind of a liberal form of government, liberal society that allows for that exchange to take place and allows for people to satisfy their desires to go places where they can be more prosperous and more productive. And I think we need more of those people here, not less. And even from my more free market oriented views, I do believe in rule of law, like you mentioned. I believe that there are borders and everything else, and I think we really got to come up with some way to have a well functioning immigration system to where we wouldn't need to have so many resources used on the border and other things because we allow for visas to match demand. Imagine that, and so I totally agree.
There have been a number of creative solutions that I think if we could just get people to talk about this in a sensible way. I mean, literally buying, there's certain kinds of visa things that we just need to create a real market.
Yeah, exactly.
You've got a certain number of people going to take every year, and whoever bids the most gets the visa.
Yeah, imagine that.
And it's not a small number; it's a large number.
Yeah, right.
My point is that there are lots of different ways to do this, and temporary programs are important. It's very important if you're concerned about border control, to allow more temporary workers, because there are plenty of people from Mexico and Latin America who do want to come north and work for a season and then go home.
Right.
If you make it very difficult for them to do that legally, the problem is they still may be compelled to go north to find work to support their families, but they're afraid to leave because then they can't come back the next season. So it's funny, people who attack seasonal worker programs don't seem to understand, if we could fix the seasonal worker program, I think it would reduce illegal immigration.
Yes.
Because people would go north and they really would go home.
Yeah.
It's not as if they all want to move to America permanently. Some of them want to work in the fields, work in construction, work in other kinds of in repair and installation and service and maintenance, things for which they're well prepared and well trained and do a good job. But then they want to go home as well. And we need to make that flow more sensible than it is now.
Totally. And I agree with you. And some of the things that I've heard from some folks on the right, but are more adamant about keeping people out, is that we should know who's coming in and out of the country. But the way you do that is through more legal immigration.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with them about that.
Right.
Unless some of them mean that, and let's have a conversation with them. Some of them genuinely just think more immigration is bad.
Yeah.
It isn't a question of whether it's illegal, whether it's confusing or anything. It's just they don't want it.
Well, and John,
they're mistaken about that.
And John, I don't necessarily want to go down this route too much, but the more I've talked to people, the more I've looked into this too, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. I'm also a little bit concerned about like the America First movement in the sense of I want to let people prosper. I want Americans to prosper. But I also want the Mexicans, I want the Chinese, I want people to prosper. I believe that we are created in God's image, and I want everyone to have the opportunity to prosper as much as possible. And oftentimes what it seems to me is that we're isolating just a narrow view of, if you're the right color or if you're from the right country or something else, that you get to be the winner and everyone else is losers. And so part of trade in economics also indicates that whenever we are trading with other countries, they buy more of our products because they're now richer. And so I worry that there's more underlying this than just the economics and everything. And, I don't want to go too far down that route, but I do think it's important for us to understand that free trade makes us richer, that trade, that immigration allows for us to be richer. And it may not be that every single person, I think maybe people from our side could be saying from a more freedom conservatism view, is that there will be trade-offs. I think maybe some on our side don't acknowledge that there will be some that are hurt by particular policies. Sure. But in general, we are going to be improved in our lot in life to prosper. What do you think about that?
I agree. I think it is a problem that is not specific to this moment.
Yeah.
It's not specific to Americans. It's not specific to American conservatives, people who vote on the right. This is a human nature problem.
Yeah.
Human beings, we spent most of our history as a species in small hunter-gatherer bands of 50 to 250 people, an average of about 150 people. And someone coming over if you're living in a hunter-gatherer society, okay, there's no significant investment, there's no way to store food, there are certain forage areas that you might try to control. Someone coming over the hill could be bringing something yummy that you've never tasted, or some idea you never had, or some other good thing, or it might be attractive and you want to marry them or something, right? So they're coming over the hill and the stranger might be good. But in that environment, the stranger is probably more often a threat. It might be a scout for another band that wants to take our watering hole. And so, unfortunately, we do have some deep-seated sort of it's not really tribal because it's pre-tribe, it's sort of pro-band, pro-clan feelings that we have. And we are all subject to those kinds of temptations. You can have not positive versions of this, which is where team sports comes from. It's basically sublimated violence, sublimated inner hunter-gatherer band violence played out on football fields. Yeah. Because if you think about it, it's not really rational to root for the Eagles instead of the Steelers. It's not like someone carefully sits down when they're 10 and decides which team. Some people do, but most people, you're born into it. It's just part of your culture. And actually, it's a pretty healthy way to channel this team spirit that everybody feels compelled to have. The unhealthy way is those people are going to take our jobs. Yeah. Those people are going to pollute our bloodstream, right? Now, the second one is obviously grotesque, but even the first one doesn't really think about, as you say correctly, Vance, zero-sum thinking, which comes naturally to human beings, right, is not actually true, but it comes natural. Positive sum is really what trade is about, but it sounds different than that. It's very easy to demagogue and play to the temptations we all have to think in terms of group identity and tribal allegiances. Well, I'm willing to be poor as long as my people do everything for ourselves. Isn't really rational. Right. But it is very human. Yeah. We need to understand that as advocates of freedom and markets and free enterprise, limited government. We need to understand that a lot of the threats to those things that we value, they're not concocted. They're not external. They are human nature. Yeah. And our founders knew that. That's why they broke up all the pieces of the federal government and had them compete with each other. And that's why also, and we mentioned another statement of principles in the Freedom Conservative statement that distinguishes us from our rivals in the right, and that is our focus on federalism and decentralization. Yes. We typically talk about checks and balances in the context of the federal government only, like the president is checked by Congress and Congress is checked by the Supreme Court. Yes. But the founders' design was also that states had their own role to play, and the federal government's role was comparatively limited. And they consciously and explicitly argued this was another way to make sure that we didn't have too much power in the hands of one person or one institution. And we have lost track of that. Freedom conservatives think we should devolve lots of power to states and localities. By definition, national conservatives think that more power should be nationalized. Yeah. More power should be moved to Washington. I think, again, they're profoundly mistaken. I understand their goals. I understand why they're frustrated by certain things, the way universities teach or the certain decisions that school boards make across the country that they're angry about. I understand their reaction, but their remedy is a cure that is worse than the disease. To nationalize the decision for Washington to decide what which book school libraries should have, or the way certain kinds of hiring practices happen at universities is not the right answer. Of course, we should prohibit racial discrimination, which universities pervasively discriminated for decades on the basis of race until recently. I was involved in that movement to strike that down. I'm very much in favor of it. What we don't want is federal government to then tell local universities, private universities, this is a process you have to use. And by the way, we're going to check and see how many conservatives are on your faculty and what you're teaching in your curriculum. That is not an appropriate role for federal government. We need to back out of that as quickly as possible. But that's the point, is freedom conservatism is partly based around the idea that we know that history is a thing. Yeah. We have a history and that the present moment is fleeting. Yeah. And 4 years from now, there will be a different president. And that president she might be from New York and she might have very famous initials, just as, for example.
Yeah.
And do you want President AOC to be issuing edicts to Baylor University about what they could teach? No. Well, then we shouldn't do it either.
Right. Yep. No, exactly. And those kind of bring us up to the last four here, which you already mentioned one, but the next one, number 7 is, and these are the principles, out of many one, which goes into federalism and the things that you just mentioned there, which I think is a huge part of the success of America and this idea.
It is.
Number 8, America's promissory note. Number 9, the shining city on a hill. And number 10, freedom of conscience. All these things are huge, and I think really help to bundle everything in that we talked about on the front 6 with these back 4 that really bring it all together, John, and making it so powerful of a statement of principles that we're covering everything. Now, it's only 10, but even the 10 commandments for
I mean, there's a reason. Right. There's a reason why we chose the number 10, Vance. It wasn't just out. Yeah, in fact, I think we had originally 9, and then it occurred to us, no, all good things come in 10.
There you go.
10 commandments, 10 Bill of Rights.
Yes.
Let's have 10. But real quick, the promissory note has to do with the fact that America had fantastic principles from the start, and we didn't live up to them. We didn't live up to them for centuries. And conservatives need to own that. We need to be among those championing the kinds of policies that will bring more opportunity for people who were descendants of slaves or descendants from immigrants, or So that is an important thing for conservatives to own. We're not talking about abandoning our principles. We're about applying our principles. This is why we believe in deregulation of occupations. It's why we believe that zoning is literally an example, at least heavy-handed zoning is in fact systemic racism.
Yeah.
The original creation of zoning, at least in certain parts of the country, really was to keep those people on the other side of town, those people away from our neighborhood.
Yeah.
That's what it was, and we need to deconstruct that. Yeah. So that's an important part of the story. Other things too.
Another one too, John, like occupational licensing.
Yes. Some of it was explicitly Jim Crow.
Yeah.
Some of these occupational licenses were designed to keep black people from taking white jobs. Yeah. That's what it was for. And we need to work on that. And similarly, the foreign policy plank is an important thing. We had to write that in a way to encompass some different views. But it's very important that we have a consistent approach to that issue that's consistent with our principles, and it serves our interests and also respects America's commitment to freedom. And that final thing about freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, it's really important to elevate that in the current context. We went through all of this stuff with DEI and all of these things in public and private institutions that constrain people's ability to treat each other as individuals. We need to defend that. Now, we're not arguing the government should regulate private activity. Private institutions should have their own principles that are consistent. But public institutions are obligated by law to protect freedom of thought, freedom of conscience. And we thought that was so important that it deserved its own plaque.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. And what are the next steps, John? A part of the Freedom Conservatism and kind of your work and everything else, but what do you feel are going to be the next steps to really help this take off, to make sure that we have something? I know there's also some work on fusionism and other things that we kind of lost some of that, but hopefully we could bring some of that back. But what say you about your optimism or pessimism about the future?
I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful. Yuval Levin would caution us, say, don't be optimistic, be hopeful.
Yeah.
Okay, but I think there's a little bit of a semantic distinction. I really think that America's DNA is sound. Its constitutional DNA is sound. I think our institutions are in great danger, but they can be rescued. I think the institution of the family is in danger, but it can be strengthened in a lot of ways. I think the institutions of our government are in danger, but I think they'll recover with our help. And I think that when it comes right down to it, America made a bet on freedom and decentralization and some other ideas that were really good ideas. And they have worked well for more than 2 centuries. Other countries, other parts of the world, they can make whatever bets they want to make, as long as they don't infringe on our freedoms. I mean, even freedom to navigate and freedom to trade with other countries. I'm in favor of the United States having a robust defense of our freedoms, not just our country, but our freedoms around the world. If they want to make other choices, fine. But I don't. And I don't think you either. I think we want to own the American system. We think it is superior. And so our job is to protect that, to extend that, to expand that, to build on it. If we do that, I think America's 21st century will be another glorious century. It won't be perfect because our 19th century America, I don't know if you heard about this, but we had a civil war.
Right.
Hundreds of thousands of Americans were killed. And finally, slavery was kind of sort of abolished, but not really. The 20th century had some grotesque events. And yet, during the 19th and 20th century, America grew and expanded, and the average American got wealthier during this entire period. The 21st century can also be a period of American excellence and expansion and prosperity. Help people prosper is your mantra, and it is, in fact, the purpose of the American Constitution. That's what it's for. It's to help people pursue happiness as they define it.
Yeah. Well, John, I could talk to you all day, and hopefully we will get more time to do so soon. I really appreciate you being on the Let People Prosper show and all the work you're doing from Freedom Conservatism, the John Poe Foundation, and so much more. There's just great things that you got going on. God bless you and your family, and I hope we get to talk again soon.
Thanks.
Thank you, John. And for the audience, I hope you enjoyed this discussion. Please go out and check out the Freedom Conservatism Statement of Principles and other things that John is working on. I'll put those in the show notes page. Remember, you can find all this at vanceginn.com or go to my Substack newsletter at vanceginn.substack.com to find the show notes and more. And until next time, God bless you and let people prosper.